people and we're talking about humans. I think often that gets forgotten when we talk about business. And I love the reaction to that. You know, it's so common to hear this like passion for the sustainability of the planet and of ingredients and animals, and that is all absolutely valid and very important. And so are people. So Not 9 to 5 is really founded on that principle, and I always like to start with that reminder. So moving to the next slide, what we've heard a lot of is about the labor shortage in our industry in particular. So there's there's a lot of talk about the labor shortage, and I just want to address this from the beginning because I have a bit of a, to be totally honest, I have a bit of a hard time with the term labor shortage, because if you really, get into it, it's not a lack of labor. People are out there working and looking for work all the time. Labor is out there, and our industry, unfortunately has had a very problematic history with turnover and also neglecting workplace mental health. And all of this plays into this quote unquote labor shortage. I actually do believe that what we're seeing is a shortage of work environments that don't provide physical and psychological safety, adequate compensation, employee benefits, supports, and other resources. So when you have that kind of work environment, you end up with a very high turnover rate. In our industry, it's been about 75% or higher for the last 3 or 4 years. This is not new, it's been growing for decades. In comparison to other industries, as you can see, that's a huge difference. And there's a massive cost to all of this. So there's a study done by the Center for Hospitality Research at Cornell a few years ago, and they came to the result of it costing approximately $6,000, and that's American dollars, in the US per person per year when they leave your establishment. So when you do the math, in comparison to that 75% or higher turnover rate, that's a lot of money that's leaving a business every year. And it's not in your labor budget, right? That's not a line item that you see that will show up. But what it's helped me understand is that there's massive costs to this, and there's a real business case for creating this kind of change in the work environment so that we don't keep ending up, where we are. And another massive reason why, there's such a huge business case for psychological safety in hospitality and tourism is because our industry struggles enormously with mental health and substance use challenges. So pre-pandemic, we surveyed our community. We had hundreds of people fill out a survey, and they all, shared many interesting things. But one stat that stood out to me that finally was so validating to see and hear was that 90% of us feel that we are experiencing mental health and or substance use challenges. So it's not some of us, it's most of us. And, this year we did another research project where we surveyed our community, and once again, hundreds of hospitality workers, owner operators filled out, and we asked specifically around certain, symptoms, anxiety, burnout, depression. You can see the high numbers there. These are drastically high numbers. And this is, obviously the pandemic didn't help anything. It didn't improve the situation. So to dive deeper into what that actually looks like in our industry, these are the 5 primary concerns. So every time we've surveyed, whether it's culinary students or whether it's owner operators, workers, these same 5 primary concerns keep coming up. Sometimes they switch, like depression and anxiety will sometimes switch places, but substance use is always in the top 3. And, obviously, whether you call it work addiction, you call it burnout, whatever you want to call it, and disordered eating, they always are there as well. And so, this is what we're hearing, this is what we're experiencing, this is what we're feeling. And this is all part of why, there's such a high turnover rate as well, and why we struggle with employee retention so much. Then we got kind of like more specific and wanted to ask, what about the work environment? What kind of work environment are you working in? How do you feel in that work environment? If the numbers are so high for how you feel with your mental health, how does that land at work, and how does that show up at work? And unfortunately, most of us do not feel comfortable speaking openly about mental health or substance use at work. And, moving to the next slide, why we don't feel that. A lot of it is around shame and stigma and not wanting to be judged. So that was, as someone who grew up in the restaurant and hospitality industry, I can tell you that I experienced this in a huge way. I always felt like I would get fired if I told my boss that I lived with depression or that I was experiencing anxiety. And so feeling that kind of, shame and stigma, it's very real. And unfortunately, what happens is it prevents folks from seeking and accepting help. And it keeps people suffering in silence. So I share this slide because I think it's really important to understand that this is what's happening for the most part in a lot of our industry. Another interesting, point to share this, is this disparity of perception of how those that are in leadership, they have the way that they see the work environment versus the way that employees and workers feel the work environment. So I found this stat really interesting. This is based on not just hospitality and tourism, but it also includes other sectors as well, like retail, again, service-oriented environments. But I found it really interesting that it's almost like half of the percentage that, feel like they work in an environment that's accepting of mental health issues and or the conversation around them. And so CEOs, the way that they see themselves, or like those in leadership positions, and I've seen this in restaurants and hotels so often, is those in leadership positions, they see themselves, they tell themselves that they're very accepting and it's a very open environment. But when you ask the rest of the team, you hear a different story. So these are high level buckets of why people leave. As I pointed out earlier, our industry has a massive turnover rate, and there's huge costs related to that turnover rate. Currently are struggling with labor shortage, and I like to share these reasons as to why people leave, because it's all connected, it's all interconnected. And I'm sure we've all had our own experiences with some of these. I know I have. So often I've had, a culture that didn't support, these conversations, or that I didn't feel like supported even me as my full self. So often I remember once actually bringing it up to a manager and telling them that, hey, I've been, I live with depression, I've been diagnosed, and I need to, change some things with my schedule because of it. And he honestly showed me a pile of resumes, and basically was like hinting at the fact that, like, I can find another worker like tomorrow. And this like message of like, you're disposable, and, basically suck it up. And, I remember constantly being told as well when I worked in restaurants, and hospitality, service oriented environments, that you check your shit at the door, that you check your emotions at the door. And this whole idea of not being able to bring emotional experiences into the workplace, very toxic. And so what basically all these reasons here of why people leave, are all connected to psychological safety. So the missing ingredient, for our entire industry and for work environments like the ones I've described already, and and the ways in which we can increase employee retention, employee satisfaction, change workplace culture is all connected to psychological safety. So if anyone is, kind of thinking, well, what does psychological safety in the workplace mean? Like, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? The question to really ask yourself is, does your team or do you feel safe to practice the following? Making mistakes, being vulnerable with one another, taking risks, giving and receiving feedback. And that, the key is like, can you do all of these things without any fear of negative consequences to how you're perceived or your job? That is really the base of psychological safety, is like, can you do these things? When you make a mistake in the workplace, what happens? Are you able to be vulnerable with those around you in the workplace? Can you take risks? And if you do, what happens? How is it received? How does it land? And when you give and receive feedback, do you feel comfortable even doing that? And also, when you do, how is that handled? All of these determine the level of psychological safety in the workplace. And to be super clear and transparent as well, like, creating a psychologically safe environment is not something that you can just, flip a switch and ta-da, we did it. It's actually the opposite of that. It is ever evolving. So everything you do every day, every week, every month, every year contributes to creating a psychologically safe environment. And another thing I like to always point out too, that often gets missed, is diversity and representation in the workplace is not just important, for all the reasons that you can think of related, to inclusion and equity, and making everyone feel safe, but also diversity can look like, it can be related to diversity of thought. It can be related to, diversity and representation of other ways in which we show up. I mean, all of us are made of so many different parts, and so often we only bring a few parts to work with us. And really being like, everyone benefits when there's more diversity and representation in the room. And also those that are coming from marginalized groups actually have a very different experience of whether they feel psychologically safe or not. It's subjective. So, each of us have different forms of privilege. And so really unpacking and getting, into and better understanding of how everyone is feeling is ultimately beneficial for everyone, versus just, a select few. So that's my definition of psychological safety. And now I want to tell you a little bit of a story. So I love this. I love this story because it was one of the first times that all of a sudden I felt like, oh, okay, like this isn't like just something that like is nice to have or sounds really good on paper. But Google basically went on a quest a number of years ago to figure out how to build the perfect team. They really were obsessed with like, how do you build the perfect team? How do you get the most high performing, high productivity, teams? And they spent a lot of money and time on this. So they gathered a ton of different organizational psychologists, sociologists, engineers, researchers, and they put this whole study together. They spoke to hundreds of teams and hundreds of people. And Google's one of the biggest companies in the world. And yes, they're tech, and yes, they're not our industry, but at the end of the day, it really came down to human behavior and sociology. And the research all pointed to psychological safety being the most important factor of high performing teams. So that is a huge point, when you're talking about the business case of psychological safety, because what that means is not only can you benefit with increased employee retention, like I mentioned earlier, and all of that, but also you can get more in your business. You will see it in your bottom line if you have a more high performing team, if you have higher productivity. Also, if you're following best practices like the leading companies in the world, like Google, Google's data indicated psychological safety more than anything else was critical to making a team work. No one wants to leave part of their personality and themselves at home. And to be able to be fully present at work, to feel psychologically safe, we must know that we can be free enough to share the things that scare us without fear, and have messy or sad or hard conversations with colleagues, even if it's hard. It's really hard. This stuff isn't easy. I'm not here to pretend to sell this to you as something that's easy. Of course it's not easy, but it's worth it because there's a massive return. And in historically, our industry, hospitality, has been really influenced by the brigade system, which is predominantly only focused on efficiency. And what you lose in that is psychological safety, because if all of your effort is on efficiency, then there's not a lot of room for humanity, which is problematic because our entire industry and businesses are made up of people, and people ultimately are the most important, valuable, biggest asset of any company. So I think another point that I like to always emphasize too is that people are an asset. And if you're studying assets, from any perspective, from any industry, any investor will tell you, you don't deplete your assets, you invest into them. So in restaurants and hospitality, traditionally, we've always seen in a budget the labor line item as problematic. And we focus so much on that percentage getting lower. So if labor is so high, oh my gosh, labor is at 25%, we need to get it down to 13, and all these kinds of ideas are wrong. And we really need to move away from them, because what we actually need to be doing is spending more into people and people work, and making the environments work for people. That will ultimately increase, our, again, like I said earlier, our bottom line and our productivity and our performance across the board. Here you can see some examples of like what you find in an environment that doesn't have psychological safety versus another environment that does have psychological safety. And it's really interesting, because when I first read these points, what really kept coming back up for me were a lot of experiences I'd had working in restaurants and hospitality. And realizing how many environments I worked in that didn't offer me psychological safety, because there was so much emphasis on mistakes. I remember that, and a lot of blame game, kind of stuff happening all the time. And what was missing was accountability. Instead of blaming, or finding the blame, it was always like this obsession with like finding the blame, like who did this, and like, they must be, punished or, reamed out or worse. Instead of also just it being focused on accountability and learning from mistakes, and seeing them as opportunities of learning, and not just opportunity of learning for that one person, but when there's a mistake that happens, if you have a psychologically safe environment and people can share with each other, like in a neutral way with respectful and thoughtful conversation, everyone learns. Everyone gets to benefit and everyone gets to learn from that mistake. And instead of making an example of someone, like that kind of old school archaic thought, that I think I've seen so many times, moving towards it being just part of business and part of work, that these things happen and let's learn from them and let's move forward. That's been something that's been really missing in this industry for a long time. So to get more specific as well on, how to start, like how do you go from, where we've been for so long, for decades and centuries of the influence of the brigade system, to, okay, let's try to foster psychological safety in the workplace now. So these are just 3 high level steps, which I always like to share. The first is you have to understand you need to invest into this. So invest into people, invest into psychological safety, invest into workplace mental health. That obviously will take money, but more importantly, takes time and effort. Sorry, one second. The time and effort that goes into this kind of work is much higher than the financial investment, because it's not something that's going to change from one day to the next, and it always has to start with leadership, because there's always going to be that hierarchical structure on some level. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't flat organizations that exist, they do, but most have some level of hierarchy. And so the people that have the most power and privilege have the most influence, and they really set the tone for the whole entire work environment. So investing time and effort is really important, and that includes training. If there is, room in the budget to also supplement with benefits and resources, great. I totally understand that that's not the case for a lot of restaurants. I've owned a restaurant before, and we definitely didn't offer benefits. We couldn't afford it at that time. But there's definitely other ways in which you can still contribute to creating a psychologically safe environment. And most of it starts with communication. So number 2, communicate with your employees effectively, and letting them know if you're not offering employee benefits, what other types of benefits and resources are available to them. It doesn't cost money to put together a resource list and engage your team and ask them what kind of resources they would like, or having other kinds of meetings around, what changes they want to see happen in the workplace. The most important part of this kind of communication is that you always center the voices of those who are most affected. And everyone has valuable insight, from the dishwasher to the janitor to the CEO to the owner operator to the marketing team to the bartenders, service workers, doesn't matter. Anyone that is part of that environment has valuable insight and needs to be part of the conversation. And in some businesses, I've seen this happen with anonymous surveys, where these surveys go out and people are allowed to say whatever the fuck they want, with no negative consequence to them. And I think that that's really important, to have the freedom to express yourself and to share your experiences, is very important. And for also those that have, again, are in a leadership position at the top, that are maybe not having the same experiences, it's really important for them to hear those. Those things being shared, because there's no other way for them to know. And the last one is developing a safe and supportive culture. So safe space is something I don't like that term very much, because again, it's a subjective term, and what may be a safe space for you is not for me, and vice versa. But I think a safer and more supportive culture is really important to try to aim for. And that, again, includes a lot of input from everyone. But it really does start with leadership. There needs to be that role modeling. There needs to be that tone set for the whole environment, for the whole business. It has to start with those at the top, because it normalizes it, and it gives permission for everyone else to do so. Okay, and now I want to chat a little bit about ROI. So return on investment for workplace mental health is very high. It's a very new topic for hospitality and tourism industry, but it's definitely an important one. And right now, where so many businesses are feeling, our industry is one of the hardest hit from the pandemic, and for so many businesses that are struggling, to come up with innovative ways in which to change their work environment or their business or new products or what have you, investing into workplace mental health and knowing that you're going to get a return is a huge opportunity for us to consider. It's not something that happens from one day to the next. Obviously, it doesn't just all of a sudden you see these massive benefits from one week to the next. But over time, the more you invest, the more you invest, the higher return you see over time. So from 1 year to the next, it's really important, obviously, also to measure all of this. But from 1 year to the next, you can start to see, the decrease in employee turnover. You can start to see the increase of employee satisfaction. You can start to see, your environment change in terms of fostering creativity, innovation, and diverse thought. It creates a more, open work culture where people can share certain ideas, take risks, make mistakes, as I said earlier, give and receive feedback, where learning becomes the priority. You're learning to strive for excellence together. And the other thing I like to also share is that you're more likely to achieve a positive ROI when you support employees along the entire mental health spectrum. So what that means is that you are promoting well-being. So promoting well-being is a big part of prevention, but that you also are involved with intervention at times and care, as well as obviously eliminating or reducing, any kind of hazards that could psychologically harm an employee. But the reason why I say that is because so often what happens is that leadership or the business only gets involved when there's a crisis. And that is very reactive. And obviously it's just not ideal for anyone, because what it means is that things were already happening for a long time that led for this crisis to happen. It's been building up over time. These things don't happen just from, 1 second to the next usually. So it's really important to understand that you need to support your employees along the entire spectrum from beginning to end. And that can include things like also normalizing the conversation of workplace accommodations. Every employer has a duty to accommodate. It's a legal duty to accommodate, and every employee has the right to a workplace accommodation. Unfortunately, this idea and these legal rights that we have aren't often shared in our industry, but it's really, really important to bring them up, because oftentimes with some accommodations, you can retain staff longer. And again, it helps create that more psychologically safe environment for everyone. Moving on to the next slide, I wanted to share, a few tools that we use. Because the really great news is that you can start tomorrow and it's free. It doesn't have to cost you anything to start to foster psychological safety in the workplace. These are 5 things that you can do starting tomorrow to help to create more psychological safety in your workplace. So I'm just going to run through them really quickly. The first one is role modeling. So even if you're not in the leadership position, so even if you're an employee, all of us have influence over each other. And sharing, your own perspectives or your own failures, or, practicing active listening, showing that you're understanding, taking breaks, going for a walk, sharing things that you do to take care of yourself, physically, mentally, like your overall well-being. All of these kinds of things that we can role model are really, really important, because it starts to, again, normalize it in the workplace and starts to spread and become, kind of like a very comfortable, normal thing that happens. If no one does it, it obviously feels more uncomfortable. And at first it may feel uncomfortable, especially if you're not used to doing that. And in no way am I saying that you need to share personal details. That's not what I'm insinuating here. But just like role modeling what you want to see in what you want to see change, trying to start with yourself, I think is one of the most important things you can do. Engagement is another one. So when I say engagement, I think oftentimes people think, well, I'm very engaging, I'm very open, so engagement and approachability as well. Both of them are kind of tied in that being present and asking questions of each other is really important. It shows that you care. It shows that you are invested. And with approachability, I think what often gets missed is it's not just about being like a friendly person, but it also really, really is tied to making time available for people to access you. That point is, with people in leadership, I really see this missing sometimes, that the manager or the general manager is often so busy that you don't feel like you can approach them. So making sure that people can book time with you, or maybe I've seen this in restaurants before where someone has a specific time or day of the week where it's kind of like open door policy and people can just kind of come in and out. That's another way that really works. Another point is mistakes, making sure that everyone feels that mistakes are okay and that there not be negative, repercussions, or that their job might be on the line if they make mistakes. That is obviously the opposite of psychological safety. But yeah, and inviting everyone to kind of share maybe their mistakes, or, talk about what learning opportunities came out of them, even big mistakes. Like, I know it's hard to really do that sometimes, but you start small. You can start small and then work your way up to bigger things, but it really does help everyone feel more like a team and more like we're in it together if everyone from leadership down is sharing the mistakes that they've made and what they've learned from them. The last one is my favorite, which is involving your team. I think it's crucial. As I said earlier, centering the voices of those who are most effective is number one. Making sure that you are, making sure that you feel that you're helping everyone feel valuable and that their insights are valuable is really important part of psychological safety. When someone is making a decision and they're in a leadership position, make sure you involve your team. You don't have to do everything that they say or that they want you to do, but you definitely need to listen to them, and you definitely need to consider their perspective when making a decision. And the last point that I want to end on is a skill that all of us can learn to develop and strengthen, which is active listening. So often, especially in restaurants and hospitality, we're so busy running around doing 10,000 things at the same time. And, we don't practice active listening. And sometimes it's not possible. And I totally understand that. I still, remember what service was like. And I still do events once in a while. And I know how that time feels. And you can't practice active listening all the time in those moments. But you definitely can work it into before or after service. And you definitely can work it into one-on-ones, and you definitely can practice this skill in staff meetings. So the difference between just hearing someone and actively listening to them is that you're listening to understand, not to respond, and that you're trying to listen to them without distractions. So you're not on your phone, you're not, kind of looking somewhere else and your body's turned this way, but you're like, yeah, I'm listening to you. That's not active listening. You have to listen with your body and your mind. You're showing the person that you're physically here. And you ideally also have to, make sure that you're treating that person with dignity and respect and not passing judgment on what they're sharing. Oftentimes, if people feel comfortable with you, they will share things that you might not want to hear or that you might not agree with. That's okay. You can still practice active listening with them in that moment and show your, support without agreeing with what they're saying, and not judging them for it. Another thing I like to share on this tool of active listening is asking questions is another way of showing someone that you're listening to them, because it means that you're trying to better understand what they're saying, or that you are actually engaged with what they're sharing with you. So that is my presentation. I ended it on active listening because I think it's one of the most important skills that we can all strengthen and develop. And I just want to thank you so much for your time and for listening. And I would love to answer any and all questions if you have any. If you don't, I can also keep sharing some other stuff.
I do have a question. Hi.
Hi.
Deacon. So I'm currently an MBA student at the University of Guelph with a focus on